1, 2, 3, 4. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk.
Welcome to Spock Talk, the podcast that explores what's the deal with Dr. Benjamin Spock. How did baby and child care become the preeminent parenting guide of the 20th century? Who gets to tell parents how to parent? I'm Deborah.
And I'm Katie. We're talking Spock because we want to understand what it is about Dr. Spock's work that endures. Why is the Spock brand around 25 years after Dr. Spock died?
Last episode, we talked about Spock's captivating personality and ability to change. In this episode, we are going to talk about money, Spock-onomics, if you will, of the parent advice industry. First, brief trivia. First editions of baby and child care sell for over $1,600 online in some instances. So if you have a copy, if you come across a copy, know that it's quite valuable.
And not just for its stellar advice.
Let's go over Spock's personal financial situation. The saga of baby and child care, like most American tales, was economically motivated from the very beginning because, like most Americans, Spock had to work for a living. And he completed a psychiatry residency at Payne Whitney way back in 1932 in order to distinguish himself from other New York City pediatric practices. And eventually, the psychology stuff, the Freudian stuff, set him apart and helped to make baby and child care different and consequently successful. Young Jane and Ben Spock didn't have a lot of money when Spock's pediatric practice wasn't bringing in a livable wage yet. In the 1930s, Jane's family kept the Spocks afloat, and after the Cheney family fortune ran out, Jane's sister, who was married to a wealthy man, regularly sent Jane money. But they were not poor. In the early 1930s, which was the Depression, they had a sailboat, a refrigerator, and a part-time maid.
I know very little about sailboats, but they just always seem like a fantastic signifier of wealth. I'm sure they're not always that much more expensive than, say, like a regular old motorboat. But the amount of leisure time it takes to learn all those knots, like, you really have to have disposable income to be able to do that.
Right. And this was the era before, like, speedboats and wakeboard boats and stuff.
Right.
Spock was on a fairly conventional career path for a physician/academic. In 1946, when Baby and Child Care was published, the Spocks moved to Rochester, Minnesota, so that Spock could pursue an academic career at the Mayo Clinic. And he didn't earn an advance for the first edition, or a lot of royalties either. It was actually a surprise word-of-mouth hit. Spock's biographer, Thomas Mayer, breaks down the bad publishing deal, bad for Spock. From 1946 until 1953, he received a total of $37,000 in royalty payments for more than 5 million copies sold of his book in paperback, $23,000 from hardcover sales. If he had signed a contract with the standard royalty rate, he would have earned at least $200,000.
Yikes.
After the book was successful, Spock tried to negotiate for a higher royalty rate with Pocket Books, and they agreed to double the royalties, but only if Spock wrote 2 more books. The hitch was, at the Mayo Clinic, they had really strict rules about publishing, and doctors on staff could only publish in medical journals. And I don't want to insult anyone, but maybe we should mention the difference between popular and academic publishing.
Right, because certainly from my perspective, and I think maybe yours too, as people who are outside of academia, that policy seems so snobby. Because it seems like today, common sense would tell us that a science book that crosses over from academia to the general public is something we celebrate. Nevertheless, okay, scholarly sources written by experts for experts, like research published in the Journal of Pediatrics or the Journal of the American Medical Association, stuff that you have to get from a medical library or a library database. They're obviously important, and they serve to disseminate and move research forward. Popular sources are written for the general public, the kind of books you can buy at Barnes & Noble or find at a public library or read on the internet. They can be trashy, but they can also introduce complex ideas to society as a whole. So both forms of writing serve important purposes. Mayo Clinic of a long time ago.
Thank you. That is a good overview. Spock couldn't publish the type of books pocketbooks wanted because those would have been popular sources, the kind sold at bookstores. He was also offered a bunch of endorsement deals, but he turned them all down because he was trying to pursue this legitimate and serious academic career path.
Endorsements like a basketball player? Could Spock have had a nursing shoe with a silhouette on it?
Do you mean a nursing shoe like nurses wear or that ladies wear when they're nursing?
I kind of think the kind that nurses wear would be more profitable.
He was offered endorsement deals from like diaper companies for baby products, pharmaceuticals, and even Heinz ketchup.
I'm trying to decide whether a pediatrician endorsement would affect my ketchup choices. I guess maybe an ad campaign where a famous pediatrician reminds us that kids will eat healthy foods as long as they're doused in ketchup. But I guess really in that situation, ranch dressing would be the one I would want the endorsement on.
Mm-hmm. In 1951, the Spocks moved for a job. Spock got a job at the University of Pittsburgh, and that was different in that the institution did not have restrictions on where faculty could publish. Pittsburgh faculty could publish in popular media like magazines, newspapers, books, even going on television. And this was not a great time for the Spocks in their personal lives. That was when Jane Spock was hospitalized and diagnosed with schizophrenia, and her treatment was very expensive. Her bills for therapy and doctor visits virtually equaled Spock's annual royalty payments. Even though he made a nice salary, his University of Pittsburgh income couldn't keep pace with the enormous bill for Jane's treatment. So he started a company called Spock Projects, and he got a very lucrative deal to write a column for Ladies' Home Journal magazine.
Again, the good old days when print magazines weren't floundering.
I know, I keep pointing that out and making you say that. But I really do feel nostalgia for magazines. Spock finally finished the 2 books that Pocketbooks had wanted, contingent on the better royalties. One was a picture book titled A Baby's First Year, and another book was titled Feeding Your Baby and Child. And he did start his own TV show. He hosted a half-hour program on the Pittsburgh Educational Station. NBC picked it up, and in 1955, the show called Dr. Spock aired nationwide on Sunday afternoons.
Okay, so please tell me he wasn't just hawking diet drugs and snake oil like today's TV doctors.
No, there's actually a good list of descriptions of the content. I received it from the Library of Congress for all 27 episodes, and the descriptions available include usually a trio of mothers on the show discussing topics like toilet training, teething, how to prepare for a second child, how to prevent Christmas hysteria.
This all sounds like advice I could use. But I love this. It's like a panel show with Spock as the moderator.
Yeah, there was an episode with 3 grandmothers, an episode with hetero parent couples, an episode with forefathers, and an episode where he visited a class for expectant fathers. I expected this to be really gender slanted, like portraying mothers as helpless and men as experts. But according to the Library of Congress descriptions, the gender distribution of experts was actually better than that. He had a lady teacher, a lady medical doctor, a lady school administrator, plus 2 episodes with male medical doctors. Not too bad for an admitted sexist.
I suppose.
Let's listen to the theme song for the show.
National Educational Television presents Parents and Dr. Spock. Dr. Benjamin Spock, a member of the staff of Arsenal Health Center, Pitt Medical School, and author of the book entitled Baby and Child Care, will discuss problems which are pertinent to all mothers.
Thank you to the WNET Group and the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. There are a scant handful of digitized recordings of this gem of a show. I watched one so far titled Fathers and Children, with Dr. Spock and 4 white guys sitting at a table having a rather freewheeling discussion about discipline, corporal punishment, working parents, the isolation and overwhelm of stay-at-home parents, paternal involvement, weekend leisure time, balancing work, community service, and family time. So the nature of the conversation is expectedly a little bit dated, but I have to say that Dr. Spock is a very good moderator. He guides the conversation. He makes sure everyone gets a turn. He asked open-ended questions. He does the, when you say blank, I hear blank kind of therapy technique of clarifying an answer. And he was a very natural television personality. And as a physician, Spock's strengths were patient care and bedside manner. And as an academic, his strength was teaching. He made his lectures very engaging. Sometimes he would even act out like a toddler temper tantrum in front of a medical school class.
I imagine Spock's impression of a toddler looks a lot like his actual reaction upon returning home from an engagement to find he had a mustard stain on his tie all afternoon.
Oh, yeah, don't mess up that blue suit.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about how Spock was a great writer, sort of the pop psychology author of his time, but he wasn't a very successful academic. He had a lot of ideas about child rearing, but he never backed them up with hard data or published any meaningful scholarly work. At Mayo, he worked on a long-term study called the Inborn Temperament Study, but the results were inconclusive and never published. At Pittsburgh, he was an ineffective administrator, and he was asked to leave administration and just teach. So instead, he resigned and he got a different job and moved to Cleveland to work at Western Reserve University. There, he worked on a child rearing study, and it made some immeasurable observations on behavior, but it didn't result in any facts. His colleagues suggested that he wasn't a very serious academic researcher, that his impressionistic Freudianism doomed the child rearing study to failure as a work of science. And he was also unpopular there because of his political activism. So he retired early in 1967. Retiring early worked out okay because of the Spock Project's income. In the mid-1960s, Spock earned annual royalties of around $30,000, and he wrote for the magazines too. In the mid-1980s, Spock earned around $150,000 a year from writing for magazines. He said, I can get up to $4,000 for even a warmed-over article on baby care. He was comparing that fee to how nobody wanted his political opinions, but still, nice attitude.
I mean, work smarter, not harder, I guess. But also it does kind of seem like a humble brag to kind of rub it in the nose of all of his former academic colleagues. Like, I don't need to spend hours toiling in a lab doing interviews, blah, blah, blah. I can just regurgitate the same article I wrote last month and make bank.
Spock claimed that before his indictment in 1968, he could earn between $150 to $200 per speech that he gave. And after his indictment, when he was very infamous, he could earn between $1,500 and $2,000.
All publicity is good publicity. I cannot think of a single other example in which an indictment has increased someone's popularity. Not a single one. 0.
Spock's book sales dipped after the indictment. At that point in time, baby and child care included ads, and all of the revenue went to the publisher. Spock filed a lawsuit to both stop the ads from running and to improve his royalties, and he was able to reach a settlement.
I just need to interject and ask, because my head is totally in the internet age, so I'm just wondering how the ads worked. Was it like before the title page and after the final page, it would be like a page of ads?
That is something to look up. I guess I've been picturing like in the back like
Right.
like a theater program.
Gotcha.
But I don't
Okay.
know.
My like millennial brain is like, oh, were they pop-ups?
Flashing.
Uh-huh.
It appeared to everyone who put any time thinking about Spock's personal finances that he was doing fine, better than average. Until the late 1990s, when Mary Morgan, Spock's second wife, issued an appeal to friends of theirs to raise money for Spock's home health care. And this did not go over well. There were several news articles about this. According to one, the Spocks lived on approximately $100,000 a year. So they weren't like ultra wealthy, but they weren't poor. They had second homes, plural, and boats and a New York City apartment. Maybe that's studio apartment, though.
Same one. Need those deli sandwiches. All right. Well, this is obviously a really sad state of affairs, and no one deserves to be reduced to poverty in their old age, but maybe fewer sailing trips to the Virgin Islands?
Yeah. Mary Morgan was 54 at the time, and I slightly wonder if she was trying to protect her inheritance. So this appeal was like an analog GoFundMe to keep Spock out of nursing home care, which I totally get. Nursing homes are sad, smelly places. Journalists who wrote about this, however, were offended that the Spock's personal finances were being drained by bills for 24-hour home nursing care. The home health care was bad enough, but they also criticized the Spock's macrobiotic chef, yoga therapy, twice-weekly psychoanalysis, and shiatsu massage. I read a couple of judgy articles that called these, quote, new age luxuries. And they called Spock a millionaire, but I'm not sure that he actually was a millionaire.
Deborah, look how far new age luxuries have come in 25 years. Now we have Gwyneth Paltrow hawking $2,000 bedazzled Ouija boards and $100,000 concrete self-heating bathtubs. We can clone our dogs. And don't get me started again on the modern importance of crystals.
It is funny how incensed these journalists were, and I just wish they could get one Goop newsletter. After Spock died in 1998, two entrepreneurs swooped in, Douglas Lee and John Buckley, when they learned that Mary Morgan was taking offers for the intellectual property rights to Spock's work. Buckley and Lee raised $14 million and bought the rights to baby and child care and the rest of Spock's articles, essays, and books, and they started the Dr. Spock Company, which was based in Menlo Park, California, and employed 25 people.
Okay, this just seems like something that would never happen today. I know we talk about how Spock benefited from the monoculture, but one thing that we have over him today is that no one would be this sloppy with their personal brand management.
Mm-hmm. The Dr. Spock Company got a 3-book deal with Simon & Schuster, and I'm pretty certain that it was one of those books that I received for my baby shower in 2009 that inspired this whole Spock Talk project. The 25 Dr. Spock Company employees launched drspock.com, the website, and they worked on syndicating content with companies like Discovery Channel and, I quote, America Online.
America Online on the World Wide Web? How futuristic!
For context and for my style guide nerds, this was when the word website was a 2-word phrase with a capital W.
When did we officially stop having to capitalize the word internet? I still sometimes do it out of habit.
I want to say like 5 years ago.
Okay, that makes me feel slightly better.
But I totally care about this. Next podcast pitch for you, a weekly conversation about punctuation.
If anyone could make it entertaining, it would be you.
Douglas Lee had a plan to offer custom marketing packages for consumer products, whereby the company would create small bits of advice for, say, orange juice cartons or cereal boxes for a fee. This makes me sad considering how Spock could have made a bunch of money from endorsements when he was alive, but he rejected those offers out of principle and in pursuit of his academic career. But this is fun to read as a 2023 person in a "that's a terrible idea" type of way. Lee saw big revenue potential in selling subscriptions for Dr. Spock content to health maintenance organizations and Fortune 500 human resources departments for use on their websites and in their newsletters.
Do you think Spock, if he were alive today, would have beaten Harvey Karp to the snoo? You know that, like, futuristic baby bassinet that just, like, shakes him?
Mm-hmm.
Imagine how much Spock would have made with his little Spock nursing shoe silhouette on the side.
Or maybe a toddler-sized Freud couch.
Do you know, to go next to your grown-up sized one in the living room.
There are a ton of press releases from the early 2000s about the Dr. Spock company appointing people to its board of directors. And they call themselves the leading parenting media company. But I'd like to point out that you can call yourself anything. Like I called our other podcast, the acclaimed podcast, It's My Screen Time Too, in the teaser for Spock Talk because our moms like it a lot.
Yeah. If you know any moms who like our podcast, tell them about it. The support of moms has given us so much. Self-esteem, high-waisted jeans. Thanks, moms. And that Kelly Clarkson song, "What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Stronger."
I tried to find out what happened to the Dr. Spock company because it just appears to fizzle out. Information about private businesses is notoriously opaque. It appears that they were unable to successfully monetize the Spock content to the original $14 million investment. In a 2004 article in Crane's Chicago Business, a firm called North Coast Capital Management closed down one of their funds, and their biggest and most problematic Fund 2 investment is an $8 million stake in the Dr. Spock company, whose main asset is trademark rights associated with the late baby doctor.
Maybe I don't understand the ins and outs of everything they were allowed to do in terms of with the Spock name, but this just seems inconceivable to me. Were we just like on the cusp of the baby care industrial complex and like there wasn't enough of a market for like everything that said the name of a famous doctor? I don't understand how they could not recoup that amount.
I'm a little bit older than you, so you might not remember the promise of the .com era for young people in this like turn of the century time when just venture capitalists were throwing millions and millions of dollars because nobody really knew what the World Wide Web was going to be, and it didn't turn out the way they had imagined. And there was like a pets.com super epic crash that revealed it was really all a house of cards. And I think the Dr. Spock company was like pets.com, but just on a smaller scale. Mm-hmm. And it also seems like maybe the venture capital funded entrepreneurs didn't try that hard. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office database, you can search it online, and the Dr. Spock company filed many, many trademarks in the early 2000s, and then all of those trademarks were dead within a few years, or at least in the same decade. They never renewed them. And there's just not a lot of information about the Dr. Spock company going bust, but I think that's because private companies don't issue optimistic press releases when their earnings don't meet expectations. In the Thomas Mayer biography, Mayer wrote that some social theorists and historians, although he does not name them, see Spock's book as a metaphor for the entire baby boom generation. I think this is just a fantastic quote because to have it end in a crass money grab is just really fitting for a 20th century giant like Spock.
I should think it's always hard for a company to flourish after the death of its visionary founder. I mean, who's even talking about Apple or Disney anymore?
Right. But this company was like formed after he died. It was a weird, optimistic pursuit, I think. I have a little bit more about Spock's legacy in the .com era. In 2010, Mary Morgan sued the Dr. Spock company, owner of drspock.com website, for breaching a royalty agreement. She claimed a year earlier in 2009 that Dr. Spock company operated, quote, the largest pediatric website in the world, which, one, how is that measured? And two, that can't possibly be true. It's an anemic, janky-looking, mostly abandoned website. I don't think it ever had a heyday. There's a blog on there that was updated once in 2021 and a few times in 2020. One of the posts is just an embedded YouTube video of the Rich Roll podcast. It's totally weird. There's a poetry section. It's a really unprofessional web presence, and I don't think it ever was a very successful company now or in the past.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, in my exploration of it, it was just it was like a static place for excerpts from older editions that no longer come printed in the newer editions.
Mm-hmm. Which was helpful for formula scum.
Oh yeah, for sure. all your formula scum needs. But let's go back to our basic question. What does this have to do with Spock's work enduring? If Morgan hadn't sold the intellectual property, and if a venture capital entrepreneur extractive capitalism type hadn't swept in and repackaged and marketed Spock's work into a baby guide empire, would Spock's work endure?
Clearly, the entrepreneurs Lee and Buckley did not turn their initial investment into a bigger fortune, but I believe that their pursuit of profit kept the Spock name and legacy alive because they put it online at a crucial time. And without the venture capitalists, I don't think a Dr. Spock website would exist. And the 3 books that were published after he passed away in 1998 may not have been published. He's still in the zeitgeist, which brings us to us. Here we are, glomming on to the long tail of the Spock legacy. Before we wrap up, let's go to a segment we call New Spock, Old Spock. In this segment, we'll take a look at early Spock advice and see what has changed since the mid-1900s. Since I'm a mom of twins, I'm always particularly drawn to twin advice. Back when baby and child care was in its earlier editions, twins were much less common than they are now. So I read this section from the 1957 edition with bemused interest. Quote, any mother of twins simply has to find shortcuts in her housework. She can go through her house room by room, stripping it of unessential furnishing and furniture that prolong house cleaning. Furthermore, she should clean only half as often as before. She can select clothes for the family that don't muss and soil quickly, that launder easily, and that, as far as possible, don't need ironing. She can select foods that require the minimum of preparation and attention. Let dishes soak clean in suds. Let them drain dry. Katie, does the 10th edition include information on preparing for twins or any tips for finding housework shortcuts?
Side note, I feel like all those descriptions of housework shortcuts are just called housework now.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think they're really shortcuts. There's almost no mention of twins in the 10th edition. They're only mentioned in passing in the section on sibling rivalry, giving parents hope, claiming, parents of twins, who are often desperate for assistance in caregiving, are frequently amazed to find how much help they received from a child as young as 3 years with tasks like fetching a bath towel, a diaper, or a bottle from the refrigerator. Deborah, you would know because you have an older child and twins. Does this check out?
And he was 3, and he was more helpful than you would think. Thanks for listening to this episode of Spock Talk. Please subscribe so you are sure to get our next episode, in which we'll wrap up our exploration of Dr. Benjamin Spock and his role in the history of parenting advice. See this episode's show notes for our references.
If you like what you're hearing, give us a like or a share on social media. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Listen to our other podcast, It's My Screen Time Too, where we review TV shows and movies made for kids.
See you soon, the next time we talk Spock.
Talk,